This model of quote unquote selling your sovereignty, it sounds very tawdry and untoward. It can be completely benign. Some people find it totally egregious, but I think that in our world, it's a last resort, but it's sometimes the only resort.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Tyler McBrien with Atossa Araxia Abrahamian, an independent journalist who writes about the cracks in the nation-state system.
The really bad part of that is that zones come with, like I said, concessions. And those concessions might include lower wages. It might include, not making companies pay into the national insurance system. Basically privatizing and deregulating and contributing to this kind of race to the bottom that takes place.
Today we're talking about Atossa's new book, The Hidden Globe, How Wealth Hacks the World. So, Atossa, I wanted to start with your reason for writing the book, which it seems in reading the first few sentences is your personal connection to your hometown, the city of Geneva. You write that I began this book about the world on a lifelong hunch. There was something strange about the place where I grew up, and then a bit later, I am and will always be a part of this world apart, a place defined by a certain placelessness. So by way of answering, what this book is about, I wonder if you could tell us why you wrote this book.
Yeah, I wrote this book for a bunch of reasons, but the first reason, or the earliest reason, is that I, like Rousseau and many other people, am a citizen of Geneva. I'm also a citizen of lots of other places, but I spent the first 18 years of my life in Geneva, Switzerland, and not just in Geneva, but also ensconced in this sort of international world of the UN and the WHO and the multinational companies that come to Geneva, and just a whole mess of nationalities and people and cultures. And as a result, I never really felt that Swiss. My school was mostly in English. I did 1 year of French school over the border in France. So there was always this sense of like, well, I'm here, but I could be there. I grew up speaking multiple languages. And so this idea that, we all belong in one place that's defined by very set boundaries and homogeneity and a sort of consistent culture didn't make any sense. And that's where I come from, right? That's my country, for lack of a better term. Fast forward, 30 years or 25 years, I'm living in New York City and I'm working as a reporter. And I started reporting on the nascent passport industry. This was the subject of my first book, The Cosmopolites. And the really short version is you can buy passports in a bunch of different countries. And I wrote a book about the people who buy them and the countries that sell them and the weird ways in which this citizenship market distorts our idea of what citizenship even means. Fast forward a few more years, and we are in 2016, in the middle of the 2015, 2016, in the run up to the election of Donald Trump. And I'm noticing that the conversation around globalization and nationalism is always framed in these binary terms, right? There's the globalists and there's the nationalists. There's the rootless cosmopolitans and there's the, what do you want to call it? Like real people. And that always seemed to me to be not really the full story, right? Because what is globalization if not a bunch of decisions made by a bunch of different states to have things work a certain way? Nationalists are actually very complicit in a lot of the sort of hallmarks of globalization. When Donald Trump was gearing up for his administration's first Davos, I asked the World Economic Forum, how many times have the various delegates been to the World Economic Forum? And it was like double digits, So the globalists and the nationalists were not necessarily mutually exclusive groups. And that was sort of the basis, at least the idea, the sort of theoretical basis for this book, in which I set out to explore all of the places between nations that link our world together, and that on the surface might look like they're challenging the nationalist idea of one people, one government, one state, one set of laws, but in reality are exploited, hijacked, and utilized by nationalists to further their own interests. So that was a really long version of how I wound up working on this book. I was also just really interested in some of the places that I ended up writing about. Some of them are at home in Geneva, like the Geneva Freeport. Others I will never go to, like outer space. And so it was really fun to tie them all together.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. You laid out a lot of what I want to dig into. A few things being perhaps the death of nationalism and the death of globalization have been greatly exaggerated. It really complicates the picture. And of course, that just the title, The Hidden Globe, implies that there's a globe that everyone sees and then something just under the surface, even though, as you write, it's often hidden in plain sight. And then also just taking us on a trip around this hidden globe to these different places. So starting with Geneva, which you call the capital of the hidden globe, can you tell us a bit more about Geneva's history and how it became almost synonymous with this type of special zone or place within a place that you describe throughout the book?
Sure. So if you say special economic zone or free zone, most people who know about these things would say, oh, they have a lot of those in China, or this is something that's really common in the Gulf. So it's not the first association you'd make to Geneva, but I go way, way, way back, to the Middle Ages, to the time of mercenaries. And what occurred to me when I was just thinking about Switzerland and why is it the way it is and why is it so weird, it occurred to me that the Swiss mercenary trade, which is exactly what it sounds like, they sold soldiers to warring monarchs next door, was kind of a proto version of the ideas that I am otherwise getting at, this sort of sale of sovereignty. In those times, no one was talking about it in those terms, right? That Switzerland was just a cluster of cantons trying to survive with very little else going for them than their wiles. And so while you had monarchs and dukes and kings in neighboring territories, Switzerland trained soldiers and sort of rented them out to them. And these soldiers ended up fighting pretty significant battles, everywhere from France to Indonesia. And this was almost Switzerland's first main export, right? It wasn't cheese, it wasn't agricultural products, it was people, it was bodies. And what the cantons did at that time is that they kind of took this ability to train armies, which is something now we associate with mostly states, and turned it into a sort of a commodity. So you fast forward after that, and you see that Switzerland is using a version of this logic in really new and interesting ways. So they were providing a lot of financing to the French kings, right, by Geneva-trained financiers and bankers. They created the Geneva Freeport, which was, again, they were using a piece of their territory, their sovereign territory, kind of creating a new set of laws around it and trying to attract commerce and trade to their land, to their shores. And more recently, of course, you have the debacle of the Swiss banks. Their power, or I guess their special status, has been watered down somewhat. I mean, you can't have a number to count the way that you used to. But for decades, Switzerland was really the go-to place for ill-gotten gains coming from abroad. And they were really not asking very many questions. And so again, it was this creation of a certain legal regime that was attractive, not so much to insiders, but to outsiders who wanted to take advantage. And so I draw a line between the sort of warring mercenaries and the legal mercenaries and the banking mercenaries, and kind of framing them in the same terms. I wouldn't say there's a straight line between these things. It's a wiggly line. It's more of an ethos. But I think that it prevails. Even today, you see cantons like Lugano and Zug that are trying to do a version of the same thing for crypto, right? And so every generation of financial products, of innovation, you're going to see the same mentality at play to bring in more investment and more wealth from other countries. Now, the reason for that is that Switzerland is a very wealthy, successful, wonderful in many ways country today, but it doesn't have a whole lot going for it in terms of, it doesn't have a huge population. It was hopelessly poor back in the beginning before the Confederation was formed. And so it's got to do what it can to get by. And I think that many countries, many states find themselves in the situation today where every country has a vote at the UN, right? Quote unquote sovereign equality, but the balance of power is just completely skewed. And economic resources are really unequal between countries. We talk a lot about economic inequality, but we don't really talk about the economic inequality between states. One of the only economists who's really made a big thing of this is Branko Milanovic. But anyway, in this very uneven terrain, states are going to do what they can do to get by. And again, Switzerland was an early leader, early inspiration for this sort of thing. But now you have places like Palau selling flags of convenience. You have small countries selling creating postage stamps, right? Just to like get a few pennies
Phone
from
numbers.
collectors, right? And so this model of quote unquote selling your sovereignty, it sounds very tawdry and untoward. It can be completely benign. It can be, some people find it totally egregious, but I think that in our world, it's a last resort, but it's sometimes the only resort.
Yeah, no, I think the example of soldier mercenaries is a great one for two reasons, because it complicates the idea of sovereignty in nation states from their inception. If you think about states as having a monopoly on violence and two states fighting each other, being a legitimate war, and then a third party comes in who's paid, is interesting. And then also that these zones and these exceptions are not just financial tax havens. There's also political dimension. There's a violent dimension, if you want to put it that way. So I want to get into some of those examples. So we've talked about Geneva, where the free port figures prominently in your book, but some of these other extraterritorial domains, there were some great examples. You take us through Prospera. There's the oceans are a jurisdiction, even to space. So what were some of your favorite examples of the extraterritorial domains that you talk about, and what do they highlight as a different dimension of the hidden globe?
My favorite extraterritorial domain is outer space, right? Because the absurdity of it, the absurdity of terrestrial countries, many of whom do not have a spacefaring capacity, to make laws that apply out there it is mind blowing. The epigraph for the book is from a poem by William Empson, the literary critic. And all you really need is a line: law makes long spokes of the short stakes of men. And I just love that so much, because in
So
my
good.
head, when I read that line, I see Luxembourg, I see their tiny little capital, I see their parliament voting on laws to recognize property in outer space, right? Like property that can be exchanged for human money. And like it's on one hand completely abstract, and on the other hand it is dead serious. It is completely real. So what happened in Luxembourg, or in space, whichever way you choose to think of it, is that in 2017 Luxembourg decided that it was going to invest in space resources. Now this was coming on the heels of a lot of very buzzy reports about asteroid mining, about all the gold and silver and platinum and water and stuff you could find in space. And the treaties that govern much of what happens in outer space were signed in the 60s and afterwards at the UN. And most of those concern things like war, there's a committee on the peaceful use of outer space. Those treaties and those agreements, the goal of them was to make sure that Russia and the US were not going to nuke each other on Mars, to put it super crudely, or the moon. And one of the important parts of these agreements is that no country could claim outer space as part of their territory, because we all know what happens when a country claims territory. Another country wants to claim it too. So that's settled, right? Nobody is trying to say the moon is mine, or this asteroid is mine. But the question remains about what happens to the things on the moon, or the stuff in an asteroid or on an asteroid, or the water, or whatever natural resources are out there. And there was some ambiguity in the agreements that we had. And so a few countries, including Luxembourg, stepped in and said, well, we can't carry on with this kind of ambiguity given the amount of interest from the commercial side in space resources. And so we're going to pass a law and we're going to make it legal. And so the result of that is that if you and I start a space mining company and we register it in Luxembourg, even though we have no connection to Luxembourg, Luxembourg will, in the event of our striking it rich, right? They will recognize that this money belongs to us, that whatever the proceeds of our incursions in outer space are rightfully ours. And this is nuts, right? But it's fascinating. It's so creative. And it's sort of, in my view, the pinnacle of this like logic of offshore thinking, right? What is space if not like the ultimate offshore location? Surprise, surprise, Luxembourg has for its entire history also done other kinds of offshore things, right? It's a close cousin to Switzerland. It really was a pioneer in a certain type of offshore tax maneuvering. And so when you think of it in those terms, with that kind of history behind it, it's not surprising that they're going to be doing nutty things in space.
No, I one of the reasons I loved the book so much, and probably what attracted me to it in the first place, is this idea of legal fictions and these contradictions. As you were talking, I was just thinking about this joke gag gift that probably Lawfare readers would find funny, but nobody else, where it's a book, and on the front it says Liechtenstein Maritime Law. And you open the book and it's just an empty notebook because Liechtenstein is twice landlocked. So it has no maritime law, but I'm realizing it's actually not that funny for another reason, because it's not so absurd that it would create maritime law, for other reasons, being that it has no shoreline.
The surprising thing is that Liechtenstein does not have a flag of convenience that it's making big bucks off of, despite being twice landlocked. Switzerland has a maritime flag. Lots of landlocked countries have them. Cameroon is landlocked, I believe. And it is a pretty big flag of convenience, not the highest end one. But this speaks to what one of the points I'm trying to get at, which is that physical geography, you need it, right? Everything's got to start somewhere, especially in a world of territorial nation states. But it's definitely not the be-all, end-all of lawmaking.
And speaking of lawmaking, I want to talk about the Dubai International Financial Center. So first of all, what is that? How did it figure into your story? And then also, can you explain a bit about this court in a box effort that was undertaken, I believe, by someone named Beer, the Englishman, if I'm not mistaken.
Mark Beer, yes.
Mark Beer, thank you. Again, what is the DIFC, and why did they need to create a legal system piecemeal from other legal systems?
Yeah, to understand the DIFC, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. And first, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, were protectorate of the British for some decades until the 1970s, when they became independent UN member states. The second thing to keep in mind is that there was a big economic boom in the Emirates around the same time, and they found oil. I think it was most significantly in the 70s and 80s. And so there was just a lot more activity going on. This isn't to say that Dubai was what a lot of people like to say was a fishing village. Like, there was a lot more going on than just some fishing, right? But there was just a big increase in like industry and economic activity. So with that said, Dubai, like Switzerland, like Luxembourg, like outer space, not a ton of people living there, not a ton of natural resources to exploit until they found oil. But once they did find oil, they wanted to bring in outside companies, right, to exploit it. They also wanted to build a different kind of economy: services, goods, finance. And in Dubai in particular, there was a port that they were going to build up to build up their economy. They wanted to take advantage of their location. The big sticking point with Dubai, and this is according to a bunch of people I interviewed who were there at the time, was that foreign companies were not versed in the local legal tradition. Whether that's because they didn't want to hire local Arabic speakers, whether they didn't respect local legal traditions in this sort of neo-colonial way, or they just couldn't be bothered. That there are plenty of reasons why, but basically, if you have let's say Deutsche Bank or a Goldman Sachs didn't want to come in and learn they just wanted to import their people and do business the way they'd always done, to the degree that they could. Dubai was also developing itself by creating these special economic zones with like perks and concessions, none of them huge, right? Like, it wasn't like you were stepping into a completely new legal regime, but there would be tax breaks, there would be fast-tracked visa processes, little things that make life a lot easier if you're setting up a company. And so the city started to become, the sort of business landscape started to become defined by these zones that would come with these big real estate developments and, infrastructure and whatnot. And one of the zones that they were really banking on, that the ruler of Dubai was banking on in the early 2000s, was the Dubai International Financial Center. So this was a zone, much like other zones with perks and concessions, but this one geared towards finance. So they were trying to bring in banks and hedge funds and various financial companies. along with the tax breaks and the labor deregulation and what have you, they also proposed to have a court within the business complex. Initially, the purpose of this court was to have a place where tenants of this zone could have their day in court. So it would be like construction issues or employee issues, or whatever you would have in the civil law, but just for people like a homeowners association or something like that. And little by little, this jurisdiction began to grow. And it didn't grow physically because the boundaries of the DIFC were pretty well determined, and it was growing up, but not so much out. But they kept allowing people to opt into their jurisdiction. And the reason for that is that they had imported the judges, in many cases, the defendants, the litigants, all the people involved in these court cases were coming from abroad. Sometimes they weren't even living there. So the judges came from Commonwealth countries. And half the time, I think they were just zooming in. This is way before COVID, by the way. They were just rented from other places, doing their secondments in Dubai. And they were experts in commercial cases, so they brought something to the table. But there was nothing homegrown about this legal tradition. It was really just made up. And I call it a Frankenstein jurisdiction because it was made up of parts of other kinds of law and people from all over. And, you could imagine, a limb from Canada and a ear from Australia and what have you. And this turned out to be very appealing, right? For the same reason that we started talking about. And that's that the companies that were coming from elsewhere wanted a sort of set of, again, legal certainty, but they also wanted to know how the law was working, and they already knew based on what they'd done before. Whereas this is kind of a long-winded way of saying that they created a court from scratch. It was like a startup court, and the person that led the charge was a lawyer named Mark Beer, British guy, worked at a bunch of multinational companies. And the way he tells it, he was really tired of getting on a plane every 3 days and flying to Mexico for a meeting and coming back. And so when this opportunity presented itself to him in Dubai, he had like a bunch of kids. And he was like, yes, this is great. Not only can I commute, half an hour instead of get on a plane all the time, but it also allows me to put some of my ideas about the law into action. And when I spoke to Mark Beer, he made it clear that for him, law was not just what you and I might think of as quote unquote justice, but it was a tool for developing economies. And the idea there is that if you have sound laws, if you have a good legal regime that companies feel comfortable operating in, they're going to come and be more inclined to put money and resources into the territory that they're coming to. And so it will allow two parties that disagree on something, there's a dispute of some kind, to have an arena to hash it out. But in providing that, it's also going to have positive economic effects. And that was part of his motivation as well for being the registrar of this court.
I think I say this in a complimentary way, but another feeling I had reading your book was one of unsettling or unmoored. And, as I'm reading, doing double takes at common idioms like having your day in court, or one that you bring up a few times is law of the land, which start to fall apart in your hands as you learn more about these Frankenstein jurisdictions or extensions of sovereignty. But I want to just stay on Beer for a bit, as well as some of the other characters in your book. The Freeport King comes to mind. Someone who is reading about your book, or just even perhaps seeing the title, may think that this is a very nefarious world, which much of it is. And therefore, many of these characters who participate in it and build it would be very resistant to speaking to you. But that wasn't the case. People were quite generous with their time, and it seemed like fairly forthcoming. So what was your experience in talking with some of these people? Rich people and their handmaidens, to put it that way, are not known for being the most open, forthcoming people, especially to journalists. So what was your experience reporting the book and talking to these people?
Well, I got lucky in that a few people were willing to talk to me, and then they say, oh, you should talk to this guy, you should talk to this person, etc. So in a sense, it's just being persistent and having a lot of time to chase people down. But I think even having written this book, I'm not really out to get anyone for the particular things they did in their career. In fact, and they might feel differently having read the book, but I rather admire the ingenuity, the cleverness, and the ability to identify these loopholes. Like, it's really clever. It's really smart. And my sort of political leanings are always like coming up against my awe. Like, wow, you came up with this. That's incredible. So there's not admiration on my part. Why did they talk to me? I mean, I think it's also just that when you see this world that most people don't see because it is hiding, you're not supposed to see it. It can feel quite lonely. And then to find someone else who sees what you see, it's nice. Like, it's gratifying and you feel less crazy. And I never thought that I would be saying that I felt less crazy after talking to a bunch of consultants and lawyers, but it did kind of, for me at least, validate what I was noticing. And I think people like attention, and I, we had some good conversations, and it also helps to be a little early to the story. My last book was about people who buy and sell passports. And at the time, I had no trouble getting people to talk because no one was talking to them to begin with. And I think now, with the past 10 years of these golden passport debacles, probably much less likely to give a journalist the time of day.
Yeah, there are a lot of creative legal constructions. I also found myself responding in this, wow, you really got to hand it to him kind of aspect. I want to get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of these zones and extraterritorial domains. What are some of the positive aspects? I mean, Mauritius is often touted as this, these zones as development policy type of case studies, if you want to call it that. But I think even just the simple idea of siphoning off tax revenue from a society can have very obvious negative effects. So what did you find were the upshot of these zones of any stripe? So, like I said, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Mm-hmm. Mauritius is a good example of a place that was able to really open itself to the world through industry, right? And definitely raise the quality of life for a lot of people. Not everyone, and probably not by as much as it could have, right? Because the zone model is based off of concessions to foreign industry, and that usually means that they're given a reason to come there. And that usually means, they're saving money, right? So could they have saved less money and given more money to the country? Sure. But in that case, it worked out. And there are lots of reasons why it worked out. And economists have written many, many, many papers about why it worked and why it didn't, and what was it about Mauritius that was successful. We don't need to get into it. But a lot of the times, zones really are just a cordoned off piece of land with some incentives for the private sector that expire after a certain amount of time, and very little in sort of systemic reform or even infrastructure investment. So you can imagine a scenario where country A says, all right, we need to bring more jobs. It would be good to have more industry. It would be good if some foreign entities came to help us build some infrastructure because we don't have a lot of money. And you can imagine a scenario where they do that, and that then has an effect on the rest of the country. It sort of, I don't want to say trickles down, but it spreads, right? The influence of these outside ideas and methods and jobs has an effect on the rest of the country. That's how it's supposed to work, right? That's the sort of theory of the special economic zone, that you start small and then you can use this as a catalyst for bigger reforms. Usually that's not the case. So that's the good and the bad. The really bad part of that is that zones come with, like I said, concessions. And those concessions might include lower wages. It might include, not making companies pay into the national insurance system. Basically privatizing and deregulating and contributing to this kind of race to the bottom that takes place when you're offshoring jobs and labor and whatnot. To me, the really, and this has been going on for some time. I don't know if you read No Logo by Naomi Klein, but that was a really wonderful early reporting on these kinds of sweatshop zones. I think what's even more nefarious than that is when you take this idea of a zone and you apply it not just to a really limited industrial context, but if say you use it in other domains. So there are 2 chapters in the book that talk about this. One is about asylum and offshore refugee detention. So since since before the 1990s, but the two big examples that I talk about is Guantanamo Bay in the 90s, when there was a whole migrant detention camp there, mostly for Haitian migrants, that was like outside of the US Constitution. And then later, piggybacking off of that, Australia's use of Nauru and Manus Island to do much the same thing. Intercept people coming by boat, send them off somewhere where Australian law, like American law, doesn't apply, and treating them horribly in a way where there's no accountability at all from the domestic side, because these places aren't on the territory, right? Gitmo was rented from Cuba, is offshore naval base. Nauru is its own country. Manus Island is part of Papua New Guinea, which is its own country. And so in both of these cases, the country sending the asylum seekers has plausible deniability. It's not their land, it's not their law, not their problem. And that creates really, really horrific scenarios for these migrants that, that these countries have yet to be held accountable for it. In fact, in the US, this is considered constitutional. So I think that as more and more countries become less and less inclined to take in refugees, we're going to see this model escalate. The European Union they just announced that they have a massive reduction in the number of irregular, quote unquote, immigration. But that's because they're pushing people away and paying other countries to keep people from leaving, right? So it's hardly a reduction in people who want to move. It's really just like boxing them in elsewhere. And the use of other countries' territory to control migration, I think, is not going to go away anytime soon. In fact, I really think that this is how it's going to look for the decades to come. The US did this to this whole Remain in Mexico plan. So I find that really ugly, personally. And I think there's another dimension of this for looking at the horrors of the future, Tyler, and that's on the environmental front. So there's a chapter in my book about flags of convenience, how ship owners can get around various rules and regulations by renting out the sovereignty of countries that sell their flags. We discussed this briefly before. And a lot of the time, this is to do with labor and tax. So cruise ships might want to pay less tax, have fewer labor regulations, and also not comply. American ones might not want to have like ADA compliant ramps in every side of the ship. And so if they rent a Liberian flag, they can get around that. There's degrees of nefariousness, right? And it, of course, depends who you are. If you're in a wheelchair and you want to go on a cruise, you're probably got to choose your ships carefully. But when it concerns the environmental impact of shipping, particularly when a ship is at the end of its life and it gets decommissioned, to states' credit, many countries, particularly the EU, the US, Japan, have realized that shipbreaking is really dirty. It pollutes. It's really bad for the people that do it. And so it needs to be regulated. The issue is that there are ways around that because, again, ship owners or the sort of all cash buyers that buy the ship from the last ship owner can get around these rules by, again, renting a flag from a place like Palau, which specializes, and I kid you not, in last journey or last voyages. And so these are single-use flags that ship owners will get just for this funeral journey from wherever the last place the ship is to the shipyard that is the least regulated, often in Pakistan, and just use that as a final passport of sorts to get where they need to go, to get around the other regulations that exist. And there's something almost poetic about it. I found it very moving to think of a ship that had been, home to many people and entertainment for many people, and just ships have such a rich inner life, and to think that they get stuck with this funeral flag and sent off. And it almost reminded me of the scene in Moby Dick where Queequeg goes off on his raft. And anyway, a lot of poetry there. But it's also really depressing because it just shows how easy it is to get around these regulations. And this doesn't just affect, we shouldn't accept it if it did just affect the people who are working at these shipbreaking yards. But it has an impact on the whole ocean. This is how this works, right? This is how the environment works. And so we should be much more opposed to this. And it's really egregious, I think.
Before I ask my question, since you mentioned trickle-down economics, I wanted to just shout out, I think, my favorite sentence in the book, which was in the chapter on space law, and you write, "Do trickle-down economics apply in zero-gravity conditions?" Which I thought was perfect. But I guess kind of branching off of what you were just saying, something that I was grappling with in reading the book was whether the creation of special rules or constructing laws within laws then render the rule of law or other regulations useless. On the one hand, the initial laws that are being circumvented are themselves constructions. So you could view these other ones as just new constructions, but there is an unsavoriness in people playing by different rules that can make other people want to play by no rules. I'm not sure there's a question here, but I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is like, who ultimately has power? And I want to bring it back to what I said earlier. This is not a stateless world, right? States still have a lot of power. They just wield it selectively. And sometimes it's because maybe, Palau created this funeral flag business with one purpose that's pretty clear. But if they wanted to shut it down, they theoretically could. Maybe they don't have a lot of resources, but like it's possible they could just scrap it, right? But they don't. Same with Liberia, same with Panama. All of these jurisdictions that make quite a lot of money off of flags, in a day they could get rid of this, but they're not going to, right? Because there are really powerful economic interests that might not be, well, in some cases they are writing the law, but they're supporting this whole regime. So on paper, states can intervene in a heartbeat, but they don't, because the world is a complicated and messy place. I think you could say the same about sanctions, which are extraterritorial, right? There are ways around sanctions, and states can find ways to crack down on those ways, but they don't always, because things got to keep moving. So states still very much have power, but money talks.
I want to end here where you end in the book, which is in Svalbard, which is part of Norway. Really fascinating rules and laws of that territory. One thing that surprised me, though, is I didn't get a strong prescriptive ending chapter, which I was actually happy about, because I feel like often those can be unsatisfactory. But you do, if I'm reading this correctly, actually find some hope in these zones, especially Svalbard, in terms of where we go from here or ways to mitigate some of these zones and extraterritorial domains' worst externalities, for lack of a better word. So why did you end with Svalbard, and what inspiration, if I can use that word, did you find there in terms of its rules and regulations, or lack thereof?
If I were to write a final prescriptive chapter that would be really boring and no one would listen to, it would go something like this. Look at how borders are selectively enforced and apply much less to rich people. We should have open borders for everyone, since everyone knows they're fake to begin with, right? But like, you can see that that's a non-starter. No one's going to listen to me. And also, everyone else is saying the other opposite. Like, I've written a lot about open borders, and I truly think it's the only ethical position. But are we going to get there in the next 10, 20, 30? Like in my lifetime? I don't know. What I found really inspiring, or at least hopeful, a little bit hopeful about Svalbard, is that it is a place that is under the control of Norway, but it has open borders thanks to this weird treaty from 1919, part of the Treaty of Versailles. And when I found out that there was a territory of Norway in the Arctic that had open borders and anyone could live there, I was like, wow, that's amazing. I got to go. So I found a way to go. I went on an art residency. It was really cool. But I thought the narrative, or whatever I read about it, was that this was kind of almost an interwar quirk and a triumph of the internationalists, and that this lovely thing came about, and it could happen again, but this is almost contingent on the circumstances. It was contingent on the circumstances, but it wasn't lovely internationalists huddling together and deciding to have a place for everyone to roam. What turned out to have been the closer to the truth is that coal interests, American coal interests, had been quite active on Svalbard before this territory was handed to Norway and also declared, free zone. And the coal interest in question was a fellow named John Munro Longyear, a Michigander from very far north. I also visited Marquette, where he was from. And he was in the run-up to the handover to Norway. Svalbard was terra nullius. It was one of the last places in the world that was unclaimed. And so it was the Wild West there. There were coal miners, there were fur traders. It was just a lot of Arctic activity from all over the world. And Longyear and his lobbyist were really, really worried that when this territory would no longer be free for all, they would have their property taken away from them. And so if you look at their correspondence with the State Department and with other trading companies, they were really taking such care to document all of their claims, to account for everything they did, just as a way of setting the groundwork to say, hey, this is mine, I was here, sort of creating a legal claim almost in the absence of legal certainty. We're back to this like wanting to know what the rules are. And meanwhile, Longyear and his lobbyist, who was on K Street, had a K Street address, were writing to the State Department saying, well, what's going on? Like, can you please make sure that we can retain our rights to this coal? Can you please make sure that like the Russians don't come in or the Norwegians? And they had this whole proposal that looked a lot like a charter city, actually, back then. But thanks, I think, in large part to their lobbying, what ended up happening in this treaty is that foreign business was given the same rights as Norwegian business, and the foreign citizens were given the same rights as Norwegian citizens. This is known as this non-discrimination clause in the treaty. And again, this sounds lovely and like utopian and cosmopolitan, but actually there's a pretty strong evidence that it was because of this guy from Michigan and his lobbyist. So on the one hand, kind of depressing, right? Like maybe there is no triumph of internationalism here. But on the other hand, if we can sort of eke that out of these pretty dismal special interests, maybe we can eke that out of others, right? Maybe we can create areas with more open borders that are more inclusive, that afford the same rights to people as they do to goods and money. Well, we've got plenty of these dismal scenarios today, so maybe that's something to think about.
So maybe not a triumph of internationalism, but perhaps a triumph of the American Midwest once again.
Yeah.
I'm about to wrap up, but if there's anything you want to add.
So I will be talking about the book at a few events. I will be in Providence, Rhode Island on November 21st. At 6:30 p.m., I believe. I will be in Washington, D.C. at Solid State Books at 7 p.m. And I will be in Baltimore at 7 p.m. at Red Emma's bookstore. And my Twitter is Atossa Araxia. You can also find events there.
Well, Atossa, thank you so much. The book was fascinating, if not a bit disorienting in the best way. I encourage people to read the book, The Hidden Globe, How Wealth Hacks the World, and for any Lawfare listeners in those cities to go to the event. But Atossa, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. That was really fun. Great questions.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other shows, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia, and your audio engineer this episode was Jay Venables of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thanks for listening.